Sometimes life doesn't pivot on those grand, sweeping gestures or loud declarations we always see in the movies. Sometimes it turns on something as fragile as a scrap of paper. We're looking at a quiet kind of memory today, a minor love story, really. An unexpected outcome born out of chance, and what happens when a man finally decides to rely on a pure, quiet instinct. It all started as a memory, a chance encounter in a humid city, and a single, delicate slip of paper. Let's dive into it.
The whole thing began with a voice on the phone. The man on the other end introduced himself simply enough. "Hi, my name is Russell Sunshine." He was stationed over in Vientiane, Laos, working for the UN Development Program. He and his wife just happened to be passing through Bangkok for a few days, and, well, some mutual friends back home had suggested they reach out. It was just a simple, courteous call from a stranger in a foreign city. You know the kind. The kind of passing connection that leads to a casual invitation for breakfast.
So they arranged to meet where Russell and his wife were staying. It was a spot that happened to sit right across the street from the narrator's apartment, a place called the Imperial. Now, from the outside, it looked like your standard run-of-the-mill three-star hotel, just kind of blending into the humid, heavy haze of a Bangkok morning. But the walls of that building harbored a dark, truly unfortunate past, a past that still lingered over its hallways and in the minds of anyone who remembered the city's history.
24. That's the number of people who perished in a sudden, terrifying fire at that hotel back in 1971. The flames, they'd spread with an unnatural speed, trapping guests in their rooms before they even knew what was happening. And tragically, many of those folks died boiling in the very bathtubs where they had desperately sought refuge from the heat. It's a heavy thing to think about. The hotel carried this grim legacy after that night. For months afterward, local tour companies actually included it on their city routes. Guides would stand right there on the sidewalk, pointing up at the scorched facade, showing curious tourists exactly which floors held the fatal rooms. Just awful.
Eventually, though, time passed and the hotel was renovated, but it immediately ran into the bizarre red tape of local zoning laws. See, it sat on Wireless Road, named for an old 1920s wireless station down the street. It was this beautiful, tree-lined diplomatic enclave, Embassy Row, and the law reserved that area strictly for embassies, ambassadorial residences, maybe a few mansions for bank executives. The developer, looking for a way out, tried a loophole. He actually tried to argue the hotel was a residence. When the courts didn't buy that, he found a truly absurd solution. They officially moved the front door to a parallel side street. Problem solved, right? At least on paper. But in reality, everyone, including our narrator, just went right on using the old, convenient front entrance by the parking lot.
But despite that heavy history baked into the bricks, the morning of this meeting was bright and unassuming. The narrator walked through that unofficial front entrance to meet Russell and his wife. They sat down, ordered breakfast, and quickly discovered they shared this tangled web of mutual friends scattered all across the globe. As the conversation settled into an easy, comfortable rhythm, the narrator looked across the table and asked Russell a simple, classic expat question. How did you first arrive in Asia?
And man, that single question triggered a long journey back in time, a flashback to a completely different era of his life. Russell recalled that while the narrator had been roughing it in the Peace Corps up in Nepal, his own entry into Asia was strictly business-related. He had been posted to New Delhi for a year, sent there to intern at several large companies and attend university lectures. He painted a picture of a year filled to the absolute brim. He was a young man out in the dust and heat of the wider world for the very first time. He was soaking in every grand adventure, every new smell, every chaotic street corner. It was a deeply, deeply formative time for him.
But as his time in India drew to a close, reality came up and tapped him on the shoulder. Just a few short weeks before he was scheduled to pack his bags and leave, the office manager approached his desk. She was a no-nonsense American woman, the kind who had seen countless young men just like him come and go. She looked down at him with this wry, knowing expression and said, "Going home soon, right? Bet you got a million stories." Russell, feeling all the pride of a newly seasoned traveler, eagerly nodded. Oh, he had stories for days. He was ready to tell them all.
Now he expected a pat on the back, maybe an invitation to share a few of those tales over a drink. But instead, she delivered a blunt reality check. She looked at him, shook her head slightly and said, "Forget it. They won't care." Talk about a cold, jarring splash of reality right in the face of a young man's fiery enthusiasm. Russell just sat there, shocked. He immediately tried to defend his great tales of adventure, asking her what on earth she meant.
There was a harsh, undeniable psychological truth in her reasoning, though. She didn't say it to be cruel, she just knew the way the world worked. She told him, it doesn't matter. They'll listen politely for a bit, and then they'll go to sleep. They have no context.
nothing to relate to in their own lives. And she was right. She knew that without a shared context, without having breathed that same dusty air, even the most thrilling foreign adventures eventually just sound like background noise to the folks back home. You just can't explain the feeling of a place to someone who has never felt it.
Naturally, Russell was highly skeptical of her cynicism. "Well, we'll see about that," he told her, clinging to his youth and optimism. She just nodded, completely unbothered, and said, "Right. Okay. When you realize what I'm saying is true, call this woman. She'll listen." And with that, she reached out and handed him a small, fragile piece of paper. Scribbled on it was a name and a phone number. Now the catch was, the number was for Los Angeles, and Russell was moving back to Washington, D.C. He actually pointed this logistical hurdle out to her, but she just shrugged, said whatever, and wished him luck. Russell took that little scrap of paper, shoved it deep into his pocket, and promptly forgot it even existed.
Time did what time always does. It moved on, uncaring. Russell left New Delhi. He flew back across the world and went home to D.C. And, just as that wise, no-nonsense manager had predicted, he sat down to tell his grand stories, and one by one, his friends and family went to sleep. The stories just fell flat. The people he loved most simply couldn't relate to the world he had just left behind. 6 months slowly drifted by. The reality of everyday American life settled back into his bones. Until one week, Russell found himself on a routine business trip out on the West Coast, in Los Angeles. He spent a couple of days in L.A. just going about his business. And then a quiet instinct flared up. Standing there in a hotel room, a continent away from India and half a country away from home, he suddenly remembered that forgotten slip of paper. He reached into his wallet. It had been tucked away in there for half a year, carrying the dust of New Delhi. He pulled it out. He looked at the stranger's name and that LA area code. You know, it's a profound moment of hesitation in a person's life. Do you make the call, or do you just throw it in the trash? Russell listened to the quiet voice in his head. He trusted a pure, sudden instinct. He picked up a phone, and he dialed the number of the woman who, supposedly, would listen. Which brings us all the way back to that sunny breakfast table at the Imperial Hotel in Bangkok, years and years later. Russell paused in his storytelling. He took a breath, looked across the table at the narrator, and then he smiled and gestured to the beaming woman sitting right beside him. "And this is she," he said, his voice just full of warmth. That stranger on the other end of the line, the name on the crinkled scrap of paper handed to him by a cynical office manager in New Delhi, was now his wife. She had listened, after all. So why does a quiet look into the past like this matter? Because it shows us that life so often pivots on the smallest, most unassuming artifacts. A scrap of paper, a blunt piece of advice from a coworker, a sudden quiet memory in a lonely hotel room 6 months later. We all receive slips of paper in our lives, pointing us toward the unknown. But it takes a specific kind of quiet courage, a reliance on pure instinct to actually pull it out of your wallet when the moment comes. The question is, the next time life hands you a slip of paper, will you trust your instinct and dial the number?